What's up, everybody? How you doing? Well, it seems that Egypt done got themselves in a pickle. So now you got all the neighbors wanting to come over and eat the food and drink all the Kool-Aid. As Pops once said, every time I'm in the kitchen, you in the kitchen. Eating up all the food, drinking all the drink, all the wine, stealing stuff, capturing kings. What the hell? What in the hell is going on? As many of you know, the Persians were one of the most dominant empires in the ancient world. There's not a lot of armies, not a lot of empires that can take on the strength of the Persian Empire. So, that being said, let's listen to Professor Breyer and see what he has to say about all this.
Now, we have to go back to the time just before Psamtik is captured. If you'll remember, the previous king is Amasis, the general who took over. And that's when really the Persians start coming in. Well, Herodotus gives us 3 versions of why the Persians came in. 3 versions. And before I give you the versions, let me just tell you that many scholars don't trust Herodotus. Right? Now, there are good reasons. He tells some fantastic tales, real tall tales. I have one colleague who even went so far as to suggest that Herodotus never was in Egypt. Never went there. Just made it up. I don't think that's right. And I don't think really they're being fair to my man Herodotus. I think that Herodotus basically should be viewed as a reporter. He reports what he sees and is told, and I think he tells it honestly. He may have been told a lot of nonsense sometimes. He reports it. But I don't think he's as bad as people think. I'll give you one example, though, of why some people say Herodotus wasn't even in Egypt. When Herodotus visited the pyramids, right, which even in his day was a great tourist site. Now remember, he speaks Greek, not Egyptian, doesn't know the language. He's got a guide taking him around probably. And he asked his guide at one point, what about the inscriptions on the pyramids? And if you remember, the guide told him that those are the onions and bread and beer. It lists the onions, bread, and beer that the workmen were given for building the pyramid. Now, obviously, no pharaoh was going to put bread and beer and onion, statistics on his pyramid. I think probably the guide couldn't read hieroglyphs and made something up. But Herodotus reports what the guide told him, not that it's the truth. But the real thing that bothers some people about Herodotus' account of his visit to the pyramids is that he never mentions the Sphinx. Never. Now, some people say, well, look, if he visited Giza, where the pyramids are, he would have mentioned the Sphinx. It's pretty impressive. Not necessarily. Remember, the Sphinx was periodically covered over with sand, so it could have been entirely covered even in Herodotus' days. That's certainly possible. Or even, not every tourist, say, to New York, mentions the Statue of Liberty. It could have been something that just didn't get into the diary. So I don't think it's fair to say he never visited Egypt. But let's look at what he says about why the Persians invaded Egypt, right? There's 3 versions. You can take your pick. Now, the first version involves an eye doctor, right? An eye doctor. It starts in the era of Amasis, when the Persians first enter. And what he says is, the Egyptians were really afraid of the Persians, rightly so. They were fierce people, warriors. And Amasis was asked by the Persians for an eye doctor. The Persians, obviously the king had an eye problem. Cambyses II would have an eye problem. Send me an eye doctor, because the Egyptians are the most skilled in medicine. And the eye doctor is sent. Now, the doctor is really ticked off at Amasis, the pharaoh of Egypt, because he doesn't want to go to the Persians. He doesn't want to leave Egypt, but he's sent out of Egypt. Right? So he goes to the Persian palace, and he wants to get even with the Pharaoh. Right? So he says to Cambyses, he says, you know, Amasis has a beautiful daughter. Why don't you ask for his daughter as a mistress? Right? It's getting even with the Pharaoh. And according to Herodotus, Cambyses does it. You know, pretty girl, why not? Sends to Amasis and says, send me your daughter as a mistress. Now, Amasis is in a bind. You know, damned if you do, damned if you don't. What does he do? He sends another girl. Right? Actually, he sends his predecessor, Apries' daughter. The young girl is dressed up in beautiful garments, gold, everything. Goes to Persia. Cambyses is happy. Right? He's happy. And then he addresses the girl, he says, you know, talking about her father. Right? He says, he's not my father, he's really fooling you. Right? I'm really Apries' daughter. Amasis sent me to fool you. And according to this version, Cambyses gets really ticked off at having been fooled, the wrong girl is sent, and he invades Egypt. Right? Version number 1.
Oh,
maybe you like it, maybe you don't.
Man.
We got 2 more.
That's crazy. That's crazy. So that's almost like a that's almost like a blind date that went wrong. Like when what was it? I think it was on Friday when Chris Tucker's character is talking to what's her name? Talking to the girl. He's like, what did you do that for? Do what? I was trying to help you out. You said she looked like Janet Jackson. She came out looking more like Freddie Jackson. Man, that is hilarious. So, this guy this Pharaoh sends somebody else's daughter to please the guy, and he starts asking her all kinds of questions. You know, if she's royal family, he trying to get the inside track because he wants more than just the woman. He wants her, and he wants all the wealth of the royal family. So he starts asking questions that she can't answer. So she's like, you know, I'm not royalty. I'm not even his daughter. I'm just a regular girl. And he gets pissed. He is heated. Because he wants to take the royal cash, the royal treasury, without a fight. So he figures if he marries the princess, you know, that'll entitle him to the funds. But that don't work out. So now he in his feelings, he gonna take it by force. Well, let's see what the other possible explanations for this war was.
Next version. In this version, a beautiful Egyptian girl is indeed sent to the Persian king, but it's not to Cambyses II, no. It's to his father, Cyrus. Right, Cyrus the Great? And Cyrus really likes this Egyptian girl. Now, at this time, remember, Cambyses would have been just a little kid, maybe 10 years old. And the kid sees that his mother is very unhappy. And he says, Mother, why are you so unhappy? And the mother explains, well, your father has this new beautiful Egyptian girl, and he's ignoring me. Now, little Cambyses II says, Mother, when I grow up, I will show those Egyptians. I will turn Egypt upside down. And then when he grows up, he remembers that his mother was slighted because an Egyptian girl was sent and invades Egypt. So that's version number 2 of why the Persians invade Egypt. But Herodotus has a third one, far more detailed, and in many ways more believable and more interesting. According to this version, there was a Greek mercenary in the Egyptian army. His name is Phanes. Now, Phanes, for some reason, Herodotus doesn't give us the reason, feels that he has not been treated properly by the Egyptian army.
Oh, well.
And he goes to Cambyses and says, I know Egypt inside out. I know the routes. I know the military. I can lead an invasion. So Phanes defects to the Persian army, right? Because he's dissatisfied. Cambyses thinks it's a good idea. He doesn't know how exactly to invade Egypt, but Phanes knows all the details. And he tells him about, you're going to come across a desert in Syria. When you reach Syria, you're going to hit the desert, and it's not easy to get through the desert without water. I can tell you how to do it. There is a king of this desert area, probably what we would call today a local sheikh, a kind of Bedouin king, and he can supply water for you. Now, according to this Herodotus version, there are really two ways that the water could come, right? Now, one way, and it's fascinating, it's the origin of the 5-cent deposit on a bottle. What Herodotus says is that into Egypt came amphora, wine jars, from Phoenicia, from other areas. All these jars come in, but you never see an empty one in Egypt. He says they got wine, you never see an empty one. What happens to them? He says, well, the deal is this. The mayor of each town is supposed to send all the empties to Memphis in the north. It's like a depot, a collecting area for the empties. And these empty amphora in Memphis are filled with water. And they are sent to this desert depot, and that's how people can cross the desert. You get all these amphora with, right? So it's like a deposit, the 5-cent deposit, they go back out. Now, what Herodotus says, though, is that this was a time of year where there weren't a lot of these jars in the desert, so that's not going to work. So what Phanes explained to him was that this Bedouin king, this sheikh, king of Arabia is actually how it's called, can have camels with water skins waiting. And that's how the Persians are going to be able to enter into Egypt. There's another slight version Herodotus gives us, and it's really the first pipeline in history, literally. He says that what they did was they sewed together camel skins for almost the whole duration of the desert, the whole length of the desert, and this is a pipeline with water bringing it for the Persian army. So you have either the pipeline version or the camels loaded with water version, but either way, Phanes has told Cambyses how you can cross the desert and enter Egypt. All right, so we've got...
So... the first one was comical. Oh my goodness, that tickled my soul. But this one, not so much. This last explanation, but it makes sense. A Greek soldier, thought he was going to come to Egypt, make a name for himself, get paid. And he didn't get paid what he wanted to get paid. I mean, it's not like he was in a union. So, but dang, that's messed up. He decides he going to go to the other side, go to the enemy, and see if they willing to pay him what he want. Well, the Democrats ain't doing nothing, so let me cross over to the Republicans and tell them everything I know, see how much they're willing to pay for this information. And I don't know if he actually got paid, but the war was definitely on. They definitely invaded Egypt. What happened after that, I'm not too familiar with the details. I know at some point the Persian Empire got dealt 2 losses. They had to take 2 L's, 2 separate occasions. One, the story of the 300, and 2 was Alexander the Great. So I don't know exactly what time period this came into play, but I'm pretty sure the professor will explain that. If not in this chapter, maybe in the future chapters. So let's get back to it.
Several versions. The latter one is much more interesting. So Cambyses enters, and he is about to sort of square off with the Egyptian army. Now the Greeks, who were in the Egyptian army about to fight Cambyses, are really ticked off at Phanes. I mean, they are furious that he has turned against them. And the two armies are facing each other on a battlefield. And the Greek members of the Egyptian army bring Phanes' sons to the battlefield. And on the battlefield, they bring them one at a time and slit their throats. And they collect the blood in bowls. And then they mix the blood with wine and water. And each Greek member of the Egyptian army drinks it. Now Phanes is watching this happen, right? So the battle takes place, and the Egyptians are routed. The Egyptians lose. And we have the Persians taking over Egypt. This is Herodotus' version of how, or three versions, of how the Persians first enter. Now, Herodotus actually is fairly kind to the Persians. He doesn't view them as these cruel tyrants. They often get a very bad press, by the way, the Persians, in ancient history, that they come into Egypt, they sack it, they rule it, you know. Maybe not so, at least Herodotus says, they're not so bad. I'll tell you why. Cambyses now is in charge, controlling Egypt, from the north. He sends his herald, a kind of ambassador in, on a ship, to work out the terms of the truce, so to speak. How much tribute do you have to send before we don't raise your country to the ground? The herald is coming in on a ship, and the Egyptians see him, and they tear the herald piece by piece, into little bits and bring it back to the town. So the Egyptians really are after, the Persians. They're not going to give in. Now Cambyses is really angry that his herald has been killed, and he comes in and really levels Memphis and the area. So now we got Cambyses angered, right? Now, the next story that we get from Herodotus, which is, again, a fantastic story, meaning literally unbelievable, but I'm going to suggest what really happened, because I don't think he's such a bad reporter. Herodotus says, now remember, Herodotus was there around 450 BC, about 75 years after these things happened. So there would have even been people who were children, perhaps, during this time, but he's not going to get an accurate report, but it's not the distant past. He's angered, right? Now, the next story that we get from Herodotus, which is, again, a fantastic story, meaning literally unbelievable, but I'm going to suggest what really happened, because I don't think he's such a bad reporter. Herodotus says, now remember, Herodotus was there around 450 BC, about 75 years after these things happened.
Okay, 75 years after it happened? I'm starting to see a pattern here. These people are coming into the game. They're coming into the situation way past when the situation actually happened. So it's like secondhand. I can understand why a lot of people don't really believe what he had to say. He wasn't actually there. He's listening to secondhand, third-hand account of what happened, and people don't know the exact truth themselves, so they just telling him anything. He's a foreigner. He's not from this area. We can run game on his ass, take his money, But then, years, generations later, other people go into Egypt and they're like, well, this ain't what actually happened. That's not what all the reports say. Well, just like now, you got people on the streets hustling, especially in big cities. When they see tourists, they want to take advantage of you. So, it happened in ancient Egypt. It happens now. So this guy is recounting stories of how Persia took over Egypt. And evidently he's got more stories to tell. But people don't know if they can believe what he's saying is true. So a lot of these historians, you know, they have to make sense of everything. Just, I'm at a loss for words. I'm not really understanding what's going on. I'm trying to understand. But if anybody has any input on this, drop something in the comments. Is any of this making sense to you? Are you gravitating to this? Let's get back to it.
So there would have even been people who were children, perhaps, during this time, but he's not going to get an accurate report, but it's not the distant past. Herodotus says, they took me to the battlefield where this battle took place, the first battle when Phanes' children's throats were slit, and the two armies were still lying on the ground, separated. Persian army one side, Egyptian army on another side. And he says, what was most curious was that the skulls of the Persians, now these are skeletons on the battleground, the skulls of the Persians were paper thin and could be pierced by a pebble. But the Egyptian skulls were quite thick, quite thick. And this is what he says he saw. He saw, right? This is not a report. He saw it. Now, he goes further. He says, I asked the Egyptians, how come the Persian skulls are thin and the Egyptian skulls are thick? And he got an explanation that is kind of like adaptation. He said, well, you know, the Egyptians, we shave our hair off. You know, the priests were shaven-headed. And he says, the sun beating down causes the skull to thicken. So it's a kind of adaptive thing. The Persians don't do this. He said, they wore skull caps, so that's why their skulls are thin. That's what he was told. Now, the big problem with the story is what really happens. I mean, surely the Egyptians would not allow their dead to lie on a battlefield for 75 years. No way. And surely Persians don't have such thinner skulls, you know, than Egyptians. And further, why would the men be separated on a battlefield? In a battle, it's hand-to-hand combat in ancient times. Why? Why would they be separate? It doesn't make sense. What was Herodotus shown? I think he saw something. My bet is this, that he was shown a cemetery, perhaps of poor people. And there were bodies lying around. Sometimes the sand blows away. Sometimes cemeteries are uncovered. As a matter of fact, if you go to Egypt today, you can see cemeteries like that. Ancient Egyptian cemeteries where you can just walk through and see bones. I think he was taken to the cemetery and said, what is it? And they told him the story of this is the battlefield. And then perhaps some skulls are thinner than others, and he asks why. And his guide makes up a story. Oh, those are the Persians. They're thin. The Egyptians are thick. Something like that. But at least, I think he's telling us what he saw. Saw bones on the ground. And then he's trying to give you an explanation of what he was told. Right? So it's a fantastic story. I mean, really just incredible. But anyway, we have Cambyses occupying Egypt, and he is ticked off because they have killed his herald, right? And he's taken control. Now he has the next king under his thumb, Psamtik, right? And he wants to see, according to Herodotus, he wants to see what kind of stuff Psamtik is made of. What kind of man is he? So he has all the nobles of Egypt brought together in a kind of almost reviewing stand, is the feeling you get when you hear it. And their daughters, including Psamtik's daughter, are dressed in rags and have water jugs and are forced to give water to the army of the Persians and forced to serve the Persians. And as these women, these noble women, are paraded in front of their fathers, they all weep. All the fathers are weeping for their daughters. except Psamtik. Psamtik doesn't look at it. I mean, he puts his head down and he doesn't weep. Cambyses still wants to see, what is Psamtik made of? All the young noble men are then paraded before their fathers. With bridles in their mouths, they are being led to execution. 2,000 of the noble youth of Egypt. Psamtik sees it go by, bows his head, doesn't weep. Everybody else is weeping. Finally, Psamtik notices an old friend of his, an old man, who is reduced to begging. He's begging from the army of Cambyses. He's in rags. And this was a nobleman, a friend. And Psamtik weeps for his old friend. Now the messenger of Cambyses reports back to Cambyses Psamtik's reactions to all this. Doesn't weep for his daughter, doesn't weep for his son. But when he sees the old friend, he's reduced to tears. Cambyses asks for the messenger, go back and find out why. And they ask Psamtik, and he says, when I saw my family, my daughter, my son, reduced to this horrible state, it was so bad that I couldn't even shed a tear. But when I saw a friend, I was able to cry. Right? So it wasn't that he didn't lack emotion, it wasn't that he didn't care, it was just the depth of feeling that he had. Now, according to the story, Cambyses was moved by this. He thought, this is a man. And he took Psamtik back with him into his palace. Right? With him into his palace. Now, according to Herodotus,